Dear members of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts, dear guests, as president of this academy, it is again my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this lecture series, Arts Meets Medicine. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend this evening because I'm still on the route, also for the academy. I would like to thank again the two deans of arts and medicine class, Dušan Šuput and Violeta Dinescu, who have once again put together such an exciting program. This evening, we will first look at the psychological and philosophical depth of music. The question is whether and to what extent our musical sensations and feelings can be traced back to neuropsychological processes in the brain. This touches on a profound problem of philosophy that has been discussed for many centuries under the name of the mind-body problem. Scientifically measurable are statistical correlations between neurochemical and neurophysiological processes in the brain and human feelings and cognitions. However, correlations are not identical with causal cause-effect relationships. Above all, reductionism is not scientifically justified. However, it must also be emphasized that this is the current state of research and that investigations are in flux. For example, in so-called brain reading, it is currently possible to reconstruct the images that a subject sees from measurements of the brain. This even has significance for applications in robotics. However, we are still a long way from being able to derive our musical sensations and ideas from such measurements. The state of the art is still that we experience music as a world of its own, whose creative dynamics are subject to its own laws. Even modern chatbots in artificial intelligence only reproduce musical texts and documents and not worlds of experience and feeling. This theme of musical worlds of experience is closely related to the second lecture this evening concerning the voice. Musical instruments also develop the peculiar effect of a voice of their own. The cello, in particular, can trigger an almost spiritual mode in us. The creative medium par excellence is the human voice. In the second lecture, we will hear more about the detailed medical and scientific conditions of voice, the anatomical, genetic, hormonal, neurological, mechanical, chemical, and thermal conditions of a voice, but also about the social and cultural conditions for the effect of a voice. But in the end, the voice is the most intimate, personal expression of human communication, which touches us the most, even in the age of technical communication. It is the human expression of its own world of experience. So it will definitely be exciting again this evening, and I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Okay, thank you also. Do you hear me? Wonderful. Yes. So I would like to ask if Birgit Harris, I would like, hello, our vice president is with us, and please, Birgit, can you say hello to us?
Yes. Thank you, Violeta. Do you see me? Do you hear me now? Yes. I just say a few words because it's so interesting this evening, and so I don't need to hold a co-paper. I'm very pleased that I can participate in this meeting this evening. And I also say to you, Violeta, and to Dušan, in the name of the whole Presidium, thank you so much for your engagement to bring all interested members of the Academy in contact. That's the real Academy. And also thank you so much to the two speakers in this evening. I wish you and the two speakers and all guests a wonderful, fruitful evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Birgit. And now I have the pleasure, I say hello in the name of Dušan also, and I have the pleasure to begin presenting Wolfgang Mastnak. He is not the first time with us. Wolfgang Mastnak is a special personality. He holds his 6 doctoral degrees in medical science, sports medicine, mathematics, arts, therapies, music education, psychology, as well as professional diploma as psychotherapist and mototherapist. And you shall see him. He is looking so young, and he is such incredible energy and acting on different continents. So, and we succeeded in capturing him. So his seminars when as a professor in the field of teaching include music didactics, philosophy of science, music and health education, neuromusic education, and transcultural music education. In doctoral studies, he mainly supervises studies on the integration of music education and music therapy. At the Bavarian Higher Education Center for China and the Bavarian Higher Education Center for Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. He is a director responsible for the music and arts colleges. His main research areas include cross-cultural psychosomatics and psychiatry, arts therapies, health education, public health and preventive medicine, sports therapy, long-term cardiac rehabilitation, perinatal health, neuropsychology, quantum consciousness, philosophy of science, and research methodology. He deals a lot with innovative ways in the field of artistic therapies and interdisciplinary research. So we have the pleasure and the honor to invite Wolfgang Mastnak.
Thank you very much indeed for this warm-hearted invitation and for describing a little bit my activities. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to present some ideas of my research in such an interesting forum, and I'm really very much looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So, the most exciting moment is going on whether the technique works and whether you can say my PowerPoint. That's always the most exciting moment. Can you see?
It's okay.
Yes,
it's
fine. Thank you. So today I would like to speak about depth psychology, the notion of parallel worlds, and music. Especially focusing on music, I picked out the Lytaniae for Celli by Violeta. In the introduction to Lytaniae, we read, its sound and its specific expression reflect the whole scope of human failings and spiritual urges. But it is also but it also gives an impressive voice to the hidden and dark sides of life, to what belongs to nightmares and the unfathomable abyss. Those words which relate to music, which relate to music played by Celli, immediately touches upon the core ideas of depth psychology, the unfathomable abyss. Those depths of life we cannot explore, which are rather in a different world. On the right side, you see a picture painted some years ago by a psychiatric patient of the Department of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy of the Technical University in Munich. This patient could explain her picture. And she said, I live in a superposition of worlds. Superposition, we know that from quantum mechanics, but she felt that there are two worlds, somehow interconnected worlds. One world, which we call the real world. For her, it was not so real. And one world, which was extremely important, which was her world, but others, psychiatrists, could not share the experiences of her world. So, we would say, from the perspective of Western psychiatry, okay, this is schizophrenia, that's hallucinations, but regarding cross-cultural psychiatry, we have also to involve other aspects. Are there perhaps different worlds which are somehow interconnected, but still different? Again, back to the picture of this patient here, you see an opening. It is an opening, and she said it is like a window that opens. And you have the impression that behind the world is the same as the world around. But in fact, it is not. So she rather thought we misunderstand the world. In fact, when I'm working in psychiatry, I often have the impression that maybe we cannot really see some worlds, some very significant worlds, which our patients can see, and this qualifies the notion of pathology. Is it really a form of disease? Let's go to music. You see here Wolfgang Ruscher. Wolfgang Ruscher from 1992 to 1998 was the dean of the classes of arts of the European Academy. He was professor at the Mozarteum in Salzburg, and he very often spoke to his students about the aulus. Here you see an old picture of the aulus, which is not a flute. It was a double reed instrument, a very expressive one. And Russia used to talk about an ancient Greek myth that the satyr Marsyas found the aulus and he played and he found it wonderful. And he said, I will challenge Apollo. He plays a form of harp, the lyra, and I would like to know who wins. So there were the judges, and Marsyas played expressively, and Apollo played on the harp, and it was good. So the judges said, okay, both is fine. Next round, you have to sing and accompany yourself. Apollo was able, but Marsyas was not able to, because he was transforming his breath, his voice, into the sound of the Aulus. And the story ends that Apollo skinned Marsyas. He killed Marsyas by skinning. Russia said, when I think over this myth, it is the contradiction between the expressiveness of the arts and the consciousness of the sciences. And they can fight against each other, but they should complement each other. I think what we are doing here at the European Academy, especially in your series Arts Meet Medicine, is this complementation, complementary approach. And Wolfgang Ruscher also mentioned a second myth. The myth when Medusa was killed. And the sisters of Medusa were very sad. And according to the myth, it was Athena, the goddess, who gave the sisters of Medusa an Aulus. An Aulus to give shape, musical shape, to their sorrow. And precisely what this myth describes is catharsis in depth psychological music therapy. It is how we get rid of traumatism by working, by transforming the grief into an artistic shape. Until today, this is something what we are doing in music therapy and trauma therapy, for example. We help patients to discover their trauma, also in the unconscious, to give the trauma shape, aesthetic, creative, artistic shape. And by playing, they're able, and this is very important, to control the mood, to control the emotion. And via controlling the emotion, they can reduce. And this is a form of healing. Both the picture we just saw and the myths about the Aulus lead us to depth psychological ideas. Depth psychology. What is that? Of course, you know Freud, who that time was born in Austria, but he was really born in Pribor, which is today in the Czech Republic in Moravia. But some decades before him, Pierre-Marie Félix Janet created a form of psychology where he was dealing with something Sigmund Freud long later called the unconscious. The unconscious, you all know, this model with the iceberg, that the major part is the unconscious, and just the conscious is the top of the iceberg. In the early days of his research, Sigmund Freud wanted to find out what or where is the place of the unconscious in the brain. That time, it was literally impossible to do that. We just had some histological approaches towards the brain, but it was far away from neuroimaging, from magnetic resonance imaging. Today, we have the new or relatively new discipline of neuropsychoanalysis. Neuropsychoanalysis is dealing with the question, unconscious processes, where are they housed in the brain? A very important structure is the so-called cortical midline structure, or the cortical midline structures. What is that? If you separate the brain, the left and the right half, you see the inner surfaces. Here you see inner surfaces, and we see especially two regions. We have here the orbitofrontal cortex. The orbitofrontal cortex is associated with the emotional self, is associated with the feeling of myself, and is also associated with a moral feeling, with ethics. This is something we can feel, but it's quite far away from cognitive reasoning. In the rear part of the brain, you see here the precuneus. The precuneus plays an important role in episodic memory and biographic memory. And this is interesting. At that moment, when you all hear this short lecture, your brain has millions of memories, but those memories are not present at the moment, but they are saved in the precuneus and associated structures. But those memories still influence how you perceive the world, how you perceive arts, how you perceive a lecture, the contents. So one point is when dealing with neuropsychoanalysis, with the cortical midline structures. And there is another structure in the brain which I really love. It's the so-called default mode network. It's again a network, and we are not able to access this network by our consciousness. But this network has possibilities to receive information from our consciousness, and it is a processor. It is processing information in an unconscious way, and in addition to that, it is probably the most important place of our creativity. So also from the perspective of neuropsychoanalysis, we say that art's unconscious and processing of the world is a very important thing of, or very important duty of the brain. In the introduction of Klaus Mainzer, the president focused on a very, very, very important problem, which is very often misunderstood in neurosciences. Neurosciences are dealing with correlations. Correlation in functional magnetic resonance tomography is dealing with the oxygen consumption in the brain, and we compare that with emotions, with behavior. Klaus Mainzer emphasized that we must not identify those things. It's just a correlation, and each form of reductionism probably violates the truth of existence. A little bit later, we come back to ontology. So what can we say at the moment? We have depth psychology, we have the world of the unconscious, we have the world of the conscious, we have the world of the arts, and the brain modulates. But most probably, the consciousness, the psyche, even if we speak about underlying mechanisms, cannot be narrowed down to only biological processes. You see here Mary Helen Priestley. She was one of the pioneers of depth psychologically based music therapy. So in her music therapeutic approaches, she used music to approach, to discover, to open the world of the unconscious. And this has very much to do with those words we were dealing with in the very beginning. Music can reflect the whole scope of the human failings and spiritual urges, and also gives an impressive voice to the hidden and dark sides of life, to what belongs to nightmares and the unfathomable abyss. We keep the idea of the arts and depth psychology in our mind, and we go a step further to the question of parallel worlds. Parallel worlds, that's not only a new notion in quantum physics, dealing with ethnology, dealing with cross-cultural medicine, dealing with cross-cultural psychiatry, we find a lot of notions speaking about parallel worlds. This January, I was invited to participate in a UNESCO project in Vietnam. My part in this project was to represent medical perspectives. It was about Muam Muang. Muam Muang is a shamanism, a form of shamanism in the northern part of Vietnam, in the mountain part. What is going on in this form of shamanism? We have the real world and we have the world of the ghosts. Normal people cannot say, I can approach this world. They cannot say, but both worlds are somehow interconnected, and it needs the shamans. And they use the power, the magic power of music to bridge the gap between the real world in which we live and the world of the ghosts. The traditional rituals lasted nearly 2 weeks, very long. My role was to discuss whether those forms of shamanism can be considered a culturally sensitive form of psychiatry, of psychiatric cure, and I think we can. We spoke about psychiatry and schizophrenia and other worlds. Maybe there's also a certain connection between those we call pathological worlds and spiritual worlds we encounter all over the world, not only in Vietnam, also in Siberia, in Korea, and so on. So, spiritual worlds know many worlds. We go to the film A Beautiful Mind that tells about a Nobel Prize laureate in mathematics who has schizophrenia. And he had the same symptoms our patient had who painted this blue picture. He saw people, he had friends in a world other people could not access. From the perspective of Western psychopathology, we could say, okay, it's a disbalance of the dopamine. It is a disbalance of the hippocampus. It is caused by a disbalance of brain functions. But maybe this is only one side of the truth. Maybe there's another side. Maybe this other side has to do with shamanism. In those cultures, there is no doubt that there are two worlds. For this psychiatric patient, there is no doubt there are two worlds. There's a superposition of the two worlds. Who knows whether there is? Philosophy. Philosophy has been dealing in many forms with the question of different worlds. Very famous in our culture, Karl Popper's three-world theory. Decades ago, Karl Popper discussed his theory with Sir Eccles, Nobel Prize laureate in physiology. And Popper said there's a physical world, and he called it the world one. And we have the world of our mind, the world of our psyche, and that's the world two. And the third one is the world of theories. It is the theories people, researchers, scientists invent. Wolfgang Mastnak, who I was speaking about and who was former dean of the class of arts, he interpreted the world three of Karl Popper as the cultural world and the world of the arts. And he was convinced that the world of the arts has its own rules, and we cannot narrow it down to the product of a composing brain. It is a different world. Again, we remember the introduction of Klaus Meinzer. We have to be aware of any reductionism. You know, Klaus Meinzer was a professor of quantum physics and philosophy in Munich. And of course, he was dealing, or he is dealing, with the many worlds ideas in quantum physics. You know, the many worlds interpretation, the so-called Everett interpretation, or, you know, Schrödinger's cat, the idea that different states can be at the same time. This is not logic. In any case, quantum physics, quantum mechanics is far beyond our logic reasoning. But until today, there's no single physical proof against this theory. At this point, I would like to invite you to keep in mind there is a high possibility that we have different worlds, parallel worlds, but those parallel worlds may have different qualities, different characters, spiritual worlds, different worlds in our private life, philosophical different worlds, and so on. Let's go back to music with the idea of depth psychology, of symbolism, and of parallel worlds. We come back to Lytaniae for cello. When I first heard this cyclus for very, very different pieces for cello. We have one piece for a 5-stringed cello, which is very extraordinary. We have a piece with a, I hope I remember correctly, with 53 celli, a very, very intensive work. We pose the question, what is Lytaniae? On the one hand, it can be a genre, litany. We know that in music, we know that in cultures. But if we focus on how different cultures use litany, we come to the ritual. When dealing with the ritual, there's the question, is the ritual a symbol? Is the ritual a form, a manifestation of another world, for example, the world of ghosts or the world of gods? Or is a ritual a bridge between our world and another world? We cannot answer the question, but we pose the question also from the perspective of Lytaniae. We mentioned depth psychological music therapy. In depth psychological music therapy or analytic music therapy, we use music as a way to the unconscious. I have to confess that when I was listening to Lytaniae, I really forgot the world around me. I got immersed in this music, and I had a feeling of a mystical amalgamation, of a mystical identification with the music. The music was not an object. The music became importance for me. And this leads to a last perspective concerning the ontology of music. It was some years ago, I was speaking to a Chinese composer, and he said, today, very much in music composition is not about the beauty, but the truth of music. And when looking back over the history of musical aesthetics, of the philosophy of music, we encounter this idea. There is a certain truth in aesthetics, a truth that is different from the truth of logics, from the truth of empiricism, but it is a truth. I want to finish with the aspect that tries to bring together the elements of my short presentation. Depth psychology, that means it is a deep, profound part in ourselves, in our mind, that is different from pure cognition. The third relates to the awareness of the possibility of different worlds, also in music. And the third is the ontology of music, is what is the true nature. I'm very, very happy and thankful for your cyclists, Dušan and Violeta, about arts meet medicine. I think the cyclists can deepen the awareness of the nature of the arts, and on the other side, artistic approaches can help to widen a medical horizon. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you also very much, Wolfgang, for your wonderful lecture. I would like now to ask Dušan to present Athanasia Printza. And at the end, we shall have the discussions.
Hello, everybody. After this wonderful lecture, I'd like to introduce Athanasia. I know her for a couple of years now, and she's very active in the Association of Medical Schools in Europe, but that's not the reason why she's here. She's very otorhinologist and everything that is actually. She's also a member of several associations, and I know that her lecture will be just as inspiring as it was yours. So, Athanasia, please start your lecture.
Hello. Good evening. It is a great pleasure to participate to the Colloquium Class 2 meets Class 3, and I would like to thank the Deans of the Class of Art and the Class of Medicine, Violeta and Dušan, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk about what I think is one of the most interesting topics in medicine and art: voice. Voice is the most personal attribute of a human being. Our voices are special because they hold unique qualities, but they are also actively produced every time we speak. So our voices are fundamental markers of our identity and also actively crafted to achieve various social meanings. When we speak, a person who cannot see us can recognize us if they're familiar with our voice. And if we are strangers, they might infer a lot from our voice, like guess our age, our gender, our background, or try to determine how we are feeling or what kind of person we are. Listeners draw upon their own experience of speaking and link that to stereotypes of their culture. Speakers might feel like projecting a particular self, molding listeners' opinions. Within certain boundaries, speakers could actually mold what listeners hear. In the broad sense, voice refers to the sound we produce to communicate meaning, ideas, opinions. Όταν είστε από κοντά. This is a lady with ALS speaking in Greek, and she responds to my question, what is concerning you about your voice? And besides all the obvious impairments, what she said is, I can't speak with anyone, they don't understand me. Only my daughter understands me sometimes. So the major impairment is that she cannot communicate orally with her voice. In a more narrow sense, voice refers to sounds produced by vocal fold vibration, that is, voiced sounds. So in this more narrow sense, applosive or whispers are not really a voice. This is a person attempting to speak, and because the vocal folds are affected by paresis, he cannot approximate the vocal folds. So he cannot modulate the airflow, and he cannot produce voiced sounds. He only speaks on a whispered voice.
Πείτε μου λίγο πώς αισθάνεστε με τη φωνή σας αυτό το διάστημα. Δεν έχω πρόβλημα. Δεν έχω συνηθίσει. Τώρα, επειδή πέρασε και τόσο καιρός, έχω συνηθίσει, αλλά οπωσδήποτε με απασχολεί.
The same goes for this person. He got one vocal fold removed to treat a tumor, and he's now not able to close the glottis. Therefore, he says that I don't have that big of a problem. I got accustomed to my new voice, but practically he can only have whispered speech. There is an ongoing debate in the clinical voice literature regarding who or what has the capacity to influence voice production. And researchers have investigated conceptualizations that were developed in different disciplines, and they have proposed a transdisciplinary theoretical approach to clinical practice addressing voice. There is now a well-known lack of consensus about use of terminology and understanding of key concepts about the conceptual basis for the classification of both etiologies and types of voice disorders. And the same goes for therapeutic processes that are assumed to facilitate voice. I will describe at some detail the transdisciplinary conceptualization because it can form a basis of better understanding of all the forces affecting voice, and it's useful for informing clinical practice. Voice clinical practice is about assessing and treating difficulties regarding voice function or general vocal ability. And voice disorders are very common. The lifetime prevalence is about 30%. So clinicians are asked to attend to a person's concerns regarding the capacity to respond to their everyday vocal demand without increased vocal effort, vocal fatigue, or changes to voice quality that draw attention to their voice in terms of impairment. Voice clinical practice also involves working with people who do not seem to have voice disorders in the traditional sense. So these are people with concerns that do not appear to pertain to difficulties with voice quality, loudness, control, or endurance. Our voice is a constant articulation of our identity, conveying information such as personal traits, social status, and emotional state. So what happens if we don't like how we articulate self or the reactions we elicit? There are many people who have vocal concerns that fall within this exact description. And this might pertain to professional life, specific situations, or gender-related sociocultural meanings. The lack of terminology regarding dysphonia has prompted researchers to investigate the frameworks and the concepts of our current classifications. I will go through some of the findings because I think they can help us understand why there is still today lack of consensus. Many vocal disorders are related to medical conditions, which of course need to be accurately diagnosed and promptly treated. But 1 in 2 persons with vocal concerns have no structural or neurological pathophysiology. And there is a reason why they have vocal concerns. Voice production is a complex physiological, biological, and psychosocial process. Therefore, the etiology for dysphonia can be multifactorial. Furthermore, voice disorders are multidisciplinary, assessed and treated. So often, clinicians describe a voice disorder based on observed laryngeal pathophysiology, and speech therapists use auditory perceptual judgments. And it gets even more complicated if we regard the terms and descriptors used at vocal training and coaching. Clinicians often use broad classification terms like functional dysphonia to define groups of disorders where there is no distinct criteria to determine a specific diagnosis for a person. And opposing to that, specific terminology may be consistently used for visibly laryngeal pathophysiology, like a polyp, nodules, paralysis, although the etiology is varying. Voice research is attempting to lead us from physiology and biomechanics to real-life voice. So a voice research goal is to establish links between the comprehension of voice physiology and biomechanics to how speakers use and control voice to communicate meaning and personal information. So researchers and clinicians are aspiring that establishing causal theories will have implications for clinical voice management, voice training, and speech technology applications. The diversity and complexity of the forces affecting voice is compelling. The forces are seen as causing or contributing to vocal function impairments, and they have been grouped together by different disciplines in various classification systems. These include living processes, various factors, human practices that are assumed to have the power to influence voice production. The transdisciplinary discourse comprises from conceptualizations developed in medicine and many social sciences disciplines that describe biophysiological and sociocultural forces. I will start by the biologically determinist view, which is the basis of our understanding, teaching, research, and clinical practice in healthcare for many years. Voice production and the sociocultural meanings associated with a voice are seen to be solely shaped by the biophysiological condition and anatomical dimensions of the speaker's body and voice organ and the listener's hearing mechanism. So the voice is seen as biologically produced and therefore innate, possessing individual characteristics. The voice is described as a result of a coordination of respiration, phonation, and resonance. Vocal fold vibration modulates airflow through the glottis, the approximated vocal folds, and produces sound, what is called the voice source, which propagates through the vocal tract and is selectively amplified or attenuated at different frequencies. This selective modification of the voice source spectrum produces perceptible contrasts, and these are used to convey different linguistic sounds and meaning. So, according to this view, the biological model states that our larynx and our two vocal folds are opening up for breathing and are closing completely for phonation. And when this approximation is complete, as in this case of the patient with one immobile vocal fold and one normal, we have the propagation of a mucosal wave. And this can be assessed on the basis of symmetry between the two vocal folds, the amplitude, the vertical propagation, or the way it is corresponding, it is changing at different vocal tasks. So our clinical practice is based on the understanding that we have to assess the larynxes for structural and functional integrity and make sure that the vocal folds are able to approximate in the midline and produce this mucosal wave. So when observing with different technologies, the larynxes, we make notice of lesions like the benign lesions seen in these pictures. We identify them as the cause of the disturbed, impaired voice, because we know that they interfere with closure of the glottis, and this is the reason for impaired mucosal wave, turbulence of the expelled airflow. So this is the explanation for impaired quality, reduced endurance, and maybe impaired loudness of the voice. Accordingly, we aim our treatment to eliminate these lesions and restore full approximation of the vocal folds and normal mucosal wave that will produce voice of normal qualities. Accordingly, our understanding of the pathophysiology informs our viewing of this larynx. This is a very small lesion that is seen not to inhibit the mucosal wave. There is mucosal wave of considerable symmetry and complete closure, so our counseling is informed accordingly, and we will advise this person not for an intervention, but for other treatments to improve his voice. The biological model has described in detail the layered structure of the vocal folds, and the function of the vocal folds with an integral layered structure is the basis for propagation of normal mucosal wave. So this knowledge informs our interpretation of the stroboscopic views here. We can see that we have complete absence of the mucosal wave on one side, and this is informative means that it tells us that this is a lesion reaching deeper layers of the vocal fold. Therefore, it will inform our decision-making, which will be to indicate an investigation for sampling and definite diagnosis, in this case, straight away. Besides lesions that inhibit approximation of the vocal folds, pathophysiology has described nicely that weakness or atrophy of the vocal folds that does not allow glottal closure, as is the case in these pictures where we have both paresis and atrophy, gives grounds for impaired voice, because there is reduced subglottal pressure generation, there is turbulent airflow through the vocal folds, reduced amplitude of mucosal wave, and as a result, impaired qualities of the voice, reduced endurance, and maybe whispered voice. So this also informs our treatment, because by augmenting the vocal fold and changing the geometry of the glottis, we can achieve complete approximation of the vocal folds, normal mucosal wave, improved or restored voice, although we are not treating the underlying disease. Besides gross structural and functional impairments, there might be cases we need to investigate the neuromuscular function by means of electromyography, and there are cases that we can modulate neuromuscular function. That is, we can proceed with electromyographically guided injection of active agents that can modulate the muscular function and improve or restore voice. And of course, the knowledge of the pathophysiology indicates that for every person with impaired voice, we need to assess for weak respiratory weakness, weakness of the larynx, weakness of the throat, the tongue, the mouth, or the facial masks, which all can contribute to impaired voice. The biological model describes that the voice source contains important information of the pitch, loudness, prosody, and voice quality, which convey meaning, biological information, and paralinguistic information. So sometimes all it takes is a simple hello to recognize a familiar voice on the phone. Research based on the biological model aims to establish connections between voice physiology and voice acoustics and perception. So the essential question in voice science is, when the output voice changes, what physiological alteration caused this change. Much of the research is based on the concept of a complex fluid structure interaction within the glottis, and it's controlled by laryngeal mask activation. The aim is a better understanding of the laryngeal adjustments that we use to change voice quality, or adopt different speaking or singing styles, or convey personal information. I will move now to the constructionist views. And these views state that voice production is an accomplishment to which speaker, listeners, or both contribute. So the voice is not just there, biologically determined, the voice is shaped by the speaker's vocal behavior. Habitual settings that the speaker might even be completely unaware of, or controlled manipulations of the voice organ, are superimposed on the biologically determined voice features. This has clinical implications. Speakers can be made aware of habitual use of voice behavior patterns that are considered either inefficient or harmful and can be modified by principles of motor learning. The speaker, according to the constructionist views, is not in control of the meanings others make of the voice or the person. So the speaker's sociocultural positioning is a result of the speaker's vocal behavior, the listener's interpretation and attribution practices, or of an interaction between speaker and listener practices. The sociocultural mediation views are based on the concept that culture has an immense influence on human intentions, beliefs, actions, including voice. And of course, it cannot be underestimated the impact of culture to all human behavior, but there is some criticism that voice cannot be viewed solely on with the view of sociocultural mediation without taking into account the biophysiological forces. The biocultural assemblage view states that there is a variety of forces inextricably conjoined that contribute to voice, and these include biophysiological forces, speaker practices, listening practices, sociocultural mediation of meaning-making practices, and a wide range of external forces that can affect voice. Recently, the stakeholder model of voice research has been proposed. This model acknowledges the experience and reality of multiple stakeholders who are viewing, experiencing, participating to the same phenomenon, the voice. And this is opposed to what is the current practice in voice research, which holds the speaker to the center of the research. The research is conducted by the researchers and clinicians, and other stakeholders are not at all taking into account. This model of research is considered pertinent a lot for voice professionals. And I'll come to voice clinical practice, which aims at evidence-based medicine and care, that is, integration of the best evidence with clinical expertise and taking into account the patient values. For this reason, many scientific bodies have produced guidelines or excuse me, fast forwarding. They have produced guidelines and they have proposed a comprehensive approach that takes into account a detailed visualization of the larynx with different techniques that establish all functions of the larynx, and they can observe the mucosal wave, acoustic analysis, aerodynamic tests, perceptual evaluation on behalf of the clinicians, and of course, subjective patient evaluation by means of validated patient-reported outcome measures which represent the people's experiences with their impaired voices. And this is so very important that you can see how many different patient-reported outcome measures have been developed over the last 2 decades for use in the voice. All these guidelines are a roadmap to a difficult landscape, because medicine is indeed a science of uncertainty and an art of probability. And our decision-making is affected by our ability to gather and process the available information. So these guidelines that I presented and others that were produced by large panels of a very comprehensive contribution of all stakeholders, with the patients and professional voice teachers involved, all these guidelines aim at improving the gathering of all the relevant and essential information. But processing is still very tricky, and I'll explain why. Contemporary medicine is based on the principle of people-centered care. That is care that is responsive to individual patient preferences and needs. And the cornerstone for this is shared decision-making. And this is not some wishful thinking. It is not just a principle. It is something that is systemically implemented by the health systems. And it means that clinicians are supporting people to make decisions that are right for them for all health issues. And the same goes, of course, for voice concerns and disorders. This is done in the healthcare in a structured way. The clinicians are responsible for presenting the facts to people, to lay people, in a way that they can understand what is the issue, why is that a problem, what are the options to take care of the issue, what will happen if people do nothing, and what different choices involve. And patients are further assisted to their choices by specifically designed and produced patient decision aids. These are attempting to simplify probability theory. That is, they are trying to help people understand how different choices are going to affect their future health. And let's try to project this to vocal concerns. We are faced by perplexity and diversity from the very beginning. So what is the issue? The issue might be a disease, or a symptom, a concern, or a desire to change voice. And if the issue is a disease, then there is a straightforward process for the clinician to support people with decisions. But because it's the clinician's responsibility to explain the problem. But if this is a concern about symptoms or a desire to change voice, the clinician should be knowledgeable and a good listener, so that the clinician will understand why is that a problem for the person. And then they can proceed jointly to the next step, which is that the clinician will explain what are the options: do nothing, clinical intervention, behavioral, surgical, medicinal, voice training, etc. And what is expected by these choices and what exactly they involve. I will say a few words for voice training, although it's not strictly speaking clinical voice practice. Voice training, there is an extended use of voice training nowadays. And we are no longer offering voice training to actors or people in the entertainment business. Voice training is being presented as an option of transforming the person's connection to their voice. And voice work fuses elements from actors training with principles from movement practices and from self-growth. And it aims that they will repattern both physical and mental behaviors. So a lot of voice training is based on a model of self-discovery with claims to both functionality and authenticity of the voice. Teachers generally use a series of breathing, vocal or physical exercises, and these programs have been, over the past years, very appealing to a broad customer base interested either in voice improvement or generally in self-improvement through the voice. In conclusion, whenever we address a person with vocal concerns, the cornerstone of our counseling is asking the person about what matters to them. How does this affect them? What they are hoping to achieve from any intervention? What outcomes would be unacceptable and what they are not willing to risk? In this long journey and wonderful journey, from our first cry to our last words, the most personal attribute of a human being is voice. And a transdisciplinary approach allows us to better comprehend the forces influencing voice, and a holistic approach of people allows us to support people to have the voices they wish and they identify with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Athanasia, for interesting lecture. And Violeta, will you open the discussion now?
Thank you very much also for, it was a wonderful, wonderful new discover for us about the voice, the most beautiful instrument in the world. I would like to open the discussion. Please, if you have also comments, you can also write them in the chat. You may also, I do not see always a rising hand. That's why please just enter discussion if I did not see you. Who would like to begin with a question? There are, of course, very many questions.
Yeah. Maybe I can ask something. There was a paper you mentioned, Athanasia, about unified theory of voice and hearing, production and perception of voice. Maybe you will be able to discuss a bit more, but when you showed some details about patients, it reminded me something about many words that Wolfgang talked about. You know, if somebody is speaking very softly, he can have a very strong impact on people. Maybe you remember the movie Godfather. You know, the Godfather was just speaking very careful, but whatever he said had some consequences. And that's one way how you can make one word of being important, you know, to make a difference. And the other one is just to shout enough to overshout everybody else, and then you maybe have some word to say. But what I want to ask directly to you is Wiener, you know, Vienna boys, they sing in this childish voice, and when they grow up, they change the voice. And how can this affect somebody's artistic performance? Is it possible that somebody could have a good voice when he's a child, and then when he becomes adolescent, he cannot never come back to the same quality of voice?
Well, to start with the integrated approach, because I think it was 3 questions that you asked.
Yeah.
I am not a strong believer of what we call interdisciplinary. I believe in transdisciplinary because I think this is the idea that whichever discipline you study or you work or it's your professional life, you need to have some understanding of the basic things that other disciplines very nicely describe, and they just didn't come into your education very strongly. And if we are discussing about voice, voice is us. it's being human, being yourself, whatever you think you are, whatever you want to be. And maybe this is changing every time we speak. So it's impossible to understand voice on terms of physiology of the larynx or the central nervous system alone, or even medicine as a whole, including psychiatric problems. It's impossible to understand voice without being willing to understand how complex human behavior is. That's the reason why I can have an excellent voice at one moment and without any other affliction at all, being completely lost with my voice under specific social circumstances. So it is also always transdisciplinary. The idea is that we need to bring this into education and research as well. The second question was about, the third one was about children growing and not so good. But what was the second one?
You know, if you have a very good voice as a child, and then you grow up, is it possible that you will never be able to get the same quality of voice? Of course, on another scale, but still, the quality of voice can you change?
Yeah, the voice is not just versatile and flexible; it's evolving. There is no way for me to see the voice as something static, even for adults. But for children, we should always think that we have a specific understanding of the speaking voice and the singing voice. And the singing voice of a child is the voice of a body that has not grown completely. So we should expect this to change, no matter what the change is, if we like it or not, as the child grows. And this, I think, is overarching everything that we can see with children's voices. What happens is that often the speaking voice is not changing so smoothly in children as well. We know this. Regarding singing, I think that singing teachers are much more familiarized than medical profession with the changes that happen to singing children. And there are many attitudes regarding whether the children should continue to participate to the same activities and singing training and all that involves while their voices change, or have a break if they experience difficulties. But I don't think we can preclude whether a child will have an excellent adult's voice or not. I don't think this is possible on a conceptual basis.
Thank you.
Did I miss
Violeta,
question? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
No, that's it. Violeta, would you let me ask something, Wolfgang? To ask you, Wolfgang, it was a very interesting talk, and you mentioned that Klaus Mainzer mentioned oversimplification, and of course, when you do research, you have to use Occam razor, let's say, to simplify as much as you can, but being aware that this simplification could be oversimplified. And you showed MRI images mostly on the medial part. What do you think on the other side, let's say Geschwind part in parietal lobe, where many associations are formed? Does it have any impact on our unconscious world? That's the first question. And the second question would be many worlds, spiritual, psychological, psychiatric changes. Then even you mentioned quantum mechanics, but what will happen, we are used to have a reference point. And if you go to many worlds, let's say everything is possible, then you lose reference point. Would you agree with that or not? That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the two questions. The first one, the sound and unconscious, I showed the medial part of the brain, which has really a lot to do with the unconscious. If we take, for example, the central processing executive mechanisms on the lateral part of the frontal lobe, this is totally accessible to our consciousness. So I think so there are good reasons to say a lot of unconscious processes on the one hand have a tendency to the middle line. At the other hand, a lot of unconscious processes have to do with dynamic processes. For example, if in music I understand a small melody, a motive, ba 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 bum, there is research that decoding is on the lateral right side of the prefrontal lobe. That is, we have clear access to that. At the same time, if, for example, music makes me angry or frightened, we discover also by magnetic resonance imaging a connection between auditory processing and the amygdala. At the same time, if we have music that is exciting and we measure, we find a certain connection between music processing areas and, for example, the dopaminergic system with the nucleus accumbens and so on. We have no direct cognitive access to the nucleus accumbens in the limbic system. That's not possible. So I think from the perspective of neurosciences, we have to reformulate in a way psychoanalytic theories. So I think there's a certain tendency, a certain trend, and I totally agree with you, Athanasia, that we speak about transdisciplinary approaches. So I think there is still a lot to do to combine, to find the bridge between neural processes, unconscious, and the arts. The second question, you're absolutely right. We have the problem that we may lose referential points. A small example. I'm also working at the medical faculty of the University in Colombo in Sri Lanka. And my duty there is to try together with colleagues to combine Western medicine with theories about abnormal mind and so on in indigenous population in Sri Lanka and South India. Now we have the problem, or perhaps it is no problem, that we have indigenous people who have certain approaches of animistic rites. So they speak to the ghosts and so on. If somebody in our culture, in Munich, says, okay, I see my dead father and I speak to them, we tend to say that's hallucination. In other cultures, it is not hallucination or not necessarily hallucination. So what I, especially in my cross-cultural medical approaches, suggest that we take reference points, but we clarify the reference points are situated on which theory, whether it is a shamanistic thought, or whether it is a neurophysiological thought, or whether I go to evidence-based effect sizes, I think, okay, that's perhaps a belief. There is no single form of reference point. For me, it was my first PhD was in mathematics with quantum physics. And that time it was extremely interesting for me that there's something like superposition and so on. And that brought me to my next research in brain sciences, to combine quantum fields in brain sciences. And I think, okay, I know that's a very problematic standpoint, but I think we have to say goodbye to absolute reference standpoints or the reference points, and rather say this reference point is in that discipline, the other is in that discipline, and we try to communicate.
Excellent. I think that artificial intelligence will have a big problem with that.
Yes, yes. It is with the artificial intelligence, we are doing some research comparing quantum computers and some processes in the brain. And we found that, for example, the error processing in quantum computers is very similar to error processing in the default mode network. So there are exciting similarities, and we are far away from knowing the outcome.
Yeah, but the network is more or less just oscillation. Probably you refer to oscillations that could be similar. There's no basic, there's no structural similarity.
It's not an absolute similarity, but it's interesting how our brain, especially those network structures, are working with error control. That is, for me, a very exciting thing, error control in the brain.
I will not make an obstacle to everybody else, so maybe we keep in touch later on.
Yeah.
And now other people could.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Discussion.
I have a comment on this point.
Wonderful. I have here in chat a question of Liz von Malotki. May I read it? So, and then, first of all, I would like to ask a question that combines both topics. How can you use art to treat the loss of speech caused by a traumatic experience? Mr. Mastnak said that art is a helpful tool to gain back a sense of control after experiencing trauma. Trauma causes changes in the brain structure. Could you please explain how a creative approach can be used in trauma therapy to support the healing of the brain? And then I suppose that Peter Hermann, you would like also to ask, okay? But first, please, both of you, Wolfgang and Athanasia, could you please answer Liz von Malotki?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, which is probably one of the most difficult questions in this area. Difficult because we know from a neuroscientific perspective that mental psychological trauma is an extremely complex thing. What I think, and it is what I say is now really hypothetical. On the one side, which is not hypothetical, we know that traumatization is able to block some neural processing. For example, I was speaking about nucleus accumbens and so on, about the centers of the joy that can be blocked. Another point is in traumatization, we have screening processes in the brain. For example, we have a normal brain has a good screening processor towards the biographical memory with the precuneus insulin, and that is fixed on some points. So we reduce rather the freedom of using whole network changes. In music therapy or in arts therapies, there are broadly speaking, two approaches. One approach I mentioned, for example, analytic music therapy. We try to, or we use music to help patients to get access to suppressed traumatic material. That is one approach. There is another approach, and in my opinion, maybe this approach has more future, even more future. I think, and also this is in line with some results of neurosciences, artistic activities, and I totally agree to Athanasia that need not be a performance like an opera, but an identity with my voice, an identity with my presentation. So those creative artistic processes in patients can reopen the brain abilities to get dynamic. And very often in psychiatry, in neuropsychiatry, I saw patients who were resistant against medication and did not respond to verbal psychotherapy. And in combined music and arts therapy, they got somehow immersed and they went away. So cognitive psychotherapy would say, oh, that's dangerous. And they fell into a form of trance. And after that, they came out and they said, I knew my way. And so I think the arts are inextricably interrelated with the nature of the brain, and the arts can rehabilitate dynamic brain structures. I think this will be a very important future. So simply speaking, the arts to help the brain to find individualized strategies, therapies to fight against the bad side of traumatism. And you're totally right, traumatism also can be a source of growth.
Thank you very much. I see hands asking. Yeah, please. You would like also to
question as well.
Thank you very much. Please, Athanasia.
I'm not expert in arts therapy, but I would like to think that arts can help us redefine ourselves. And the process of dealing with trauma is so complicated that it inevitably involves redefining ourselves. And I would like to just offer my experience with people who have lost the ability to speak completely, aphonia, following trauma. And my experience is that we should never forget that speech, it's not just an embodied function. Embodiment is the definition of speech. So you cannot separate our brains, our emotional investment on everything, and our body. And what happens is that I work in a structured, systematic way with these people, with voice somatic approaches. And this involves a lot of improvement. It brings about improvement, although they will work separately on the basis of psychotherapy or art therapy, whatever else they will do. Because I believe, and I have results, that they need to redefine their relation with their voice.
Yeah.
Because their voice and the ability to speak is just a result of the trauma.
Yeah.
It's still there, and they need to get this back. And we never know which way I will get it back and which way many other individuals will go all this process. But definitely I wouldn't separate the body, and I wouldn't see this as just finding solutions. It's redefining yourself and moving
I
ahead.
totally agree. Totally.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for these questions. We have three answers. We have three questions from Peter Hermann, Martin Kowalewski, and Adalbert Grote. So please, Peter, could you please?
Yeah, it concerns both contributions. Thanks very much to both of you. I would not disagree, but I would qualify the point you made with a missing reference point. I would suggest that we may have a common reference point, namely history. And this is a little bit what I missed in the contributions, that history matters in terms of what we perceive in terms of being embedded in something socio-historical, that what we perceive, how we express something, and that is, of course, then relevant in different perspectives. But it is a common denominator on which we can agree, perhaps, and from where we can start to qualify then as well what I would suggest or ask. You said, Anastasia, it's a very personal thing. It's a subjective thing as well, voice. But at the same time, it is something that is taking place in society, that is taking place in a reality. And the reality can be very different. Is then, can we say arts, there is something mediating between this subjective, very personal thing and what is then the historical reality. Bringing me then to a tricky question. Since the 1930s, Paul Valéry was talking about the reproduction, that we are able to reproduce something, reproduce voices, reproduce arts. Basically, we can reproduce everything. That was a start. What Benjamin went on with this in later stage on talking about arts. What does this make actually? Do we lose, or does voice lose the personal character? Because then there was this remark in the chat as well. You probably all heard about Beethoven's 10th Symphony, which he never composed. But this is part of the possibility to reproduce something, as well going next step then, artificial intelligence and having to produce something that seems to be very personal. Beethoven is unique, but apparently isn't. So just a set of questions.
Well, Wolfgang?
No,
Go first.
Athanasia, begin.
Okay, I'll start from the last, because I think I have a straightforward approach. It's personal. From all the studying of voice technologies nowadays and the complexity of human voice, we are not there yet. I don't know if we will ever be there, because all the acoustics theory that has researched extensively for almost 4 decades, what happens is that we cannot have models that really approximate. We have nice models that explain phenomena related to the human voice, but we cannot approximate the active, flexible, and unpredictable way that the human voice changes. So artificially produced voice nowadays is still not naturally sounding, and naturally means that our brains do not feel that they are listening to a person. And I'm not referring to simple applications that do not use reproduction of human voice and speech, because many applications, they are based on taking segments of actual spoken language and recreating some sort of messages, oral messages. So I don't think we will get there, hopefully, because I would like to be able to say if I am communicating with a living person, but who knows? And then this is what living in society is. If we get there, we have to reinvent ourselves, because then communication wouldn't be just communication between living humans. It will be communication with other existences that are not living humans. So this is what I believe for artificially produced voice.
Thank you so much for your answer. And I just would like to add something very small and also somehow a question. You focus on voice and identity, voice and the self. We know that in neonatology, preterm infants, preterm born babies, they have a high risk for neurological problems a lifelong. We know today that singing mothers around the delivery, so perinatal and postnatal in neonatology, singing mothers can extremely reduce the long-term neurological problems of this person. But we know that most probably the failing of the mother, of the singing mother, that the sound is good for the baby, she feels well in her sound, she feels identical with her sound, makes a difference. After our session, I will contact you, and I would like to ask you whether you would like to do some research in neonatology, voice and brain, and the brain development of the body and the sound self of the mother.
I do that too.
Thank you so much. It's an idea of corresponding also later. It's very fruitful, very important for our meetings. I would like now, we have two more questions until now, to invite Martin Kowalewski to ask you something. Martin?
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, I have thought about a reference point. Maybe as a philosopher, for me, it's near to say, it's for Mr. Mastnak now, it is near to say maybe language can be such a reference point, because in language we talk about ontology and such things, because I was very impressed about when you said that your work has this relation to music ontology, because it's all these parts of the mind and of the unconscious things are working together in all this, if I understood you right. And so I would like, for me, it is interesting how you can go on with your thoughts about music ontology, because we can talk about music maybe in the terms of phenomenology or in Gestalt psychology, and have other terms than the normal way to talk about music. And maybe we can have a reference point in language, and then we have certain possibilities. We can think hermeneutically. There's a person which has a cultural background, and there are some phenomena in his life, and music has a connection to this. And okay, if we take language, there's a problem because what Wittgenstein called Lebensform is the basic. And so if another culture there, you have some things, you have some problems you have to work on. But to find an ontology of the work, because you are often so near to language when you talk about catharsis and such things. And you said you wanted to work in a transdisciplinary way, because the music we can discuss, and we have things in World 3 if we go to Popper, and I know something about psychology. Maybe I know something about conditioning of people and how they react, and I can think about me and say, oh, there are such things, and I knew something more about me, and this may change my life. And I can get a musical impression, and that may also change my life. And do you think there's a possibility to find, do you see ways to go on in working on such a music ontology?
Thank you very much indeed for this philosophical question and the philosophical perspective. I do not think that we will be able to find one consistent ontology of music. I think I totally agree it has to do with language, and it has to do with cultures. So I'm happy to see here Yu Hui from probably China. We just finished at Beijing Daxue, at Peking University, a research project on music in last phase of oncology, of cancer. So it was stomach cancer, and most of the people knew they will die. They accepted painkillers, and many of our patients said, I have to deal with the end of life. And for some of them, most important was the guqin. The guqin is very old. Some traditions say it's 5,000 years old, and it is deeply involved with the thought of Dao Jiao, of the Taoism. And many patients said, I hear the guqin. It was really played at hospital by a guqin player, and I get one with the sound, with the music. I feel that the reality, that the existence of music is my reality, is my existence, and I feel, which is one core in the Tao Te Ching, in the principles of Taoism, that transformation. And I feel that I will be transformed at hospital. They call that cancer, and they say you will die. But through music, I feel it will be a transformation. I think this has something to do with this wide and broad field of music ontology. What is music? There will not be. I think there will not be one answer, but we have to bring together, you from philosophy, with, for example, Jean Gebser, who said that we have to integrate the views to a perspective comprehension of the world. Perhaps this is the goal.
Okay, this
I don't
is
want
very
one
interesting. Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. We have also the question of
Grote.
Adalbert Grote. I read here, but I would like also Adalbert maybe to speak himself. First of all, Adalbert, first of all, I would like to ask a question that combines both topics. Oh, excuse me, I will begin to read something else. Excuse me. So, Adalbert, I noticed that you combined art, music and art, with the unconscious. I feel a little bit unwell with this in this generalized way. So
what is to
to
say about the
Okay.
fascinating forms of a symphony by Beethoven or the tricky structures of a fugue by Bach? Is that also only unconsciousness or irrationality? Are you speaking only of the perception, or are you integrating also the process of making art, which is not only an irrational act? Thank you in advance.
Yeah, that's a very, very important contribute. So I never would like to reduce music to an unconscious process. It is one perspective. When you speak about the perception of a Beethoven symphony or the structure of a fugue by Bach, on the one hand, there are neurophysiological tests. For example, we know that some highly trained musicians, when they listen to the Musikalisches Opfer by Bach, it is very dominant, the prefrontal lobes, so they are really active, and we cannot say, which was an opinion 20 years ago, that music is just on the right side, especially in highly trained musicians, it's on the both sides. Once again, I would not like to narrow down musical reception just on brain functions. It also has a lot to do, we know that from music therapy, how did musical experience influence the self. For example, early experiences with the voice. How does that influence the experience of a Beethoven symphony? I really would like to warn against all forms of reductionism. Psychology or neurosciences that say we are about to debunk music and we know what are the backgrounds. To me, such approaches are one perspective to widen a horizon, but for me, there is a music and the arts is a mysterium. We can never explore it to the bottoms, and it always will need a form of collaboration, of transdisciplinary collaboration. So I think, and thank you very much indeed for this contribution, we must not devaluate the value of the arts by scientific approaches. It's perspectives, but the core is the world of the arts, and that's intangible, I think.
Thank you very much.
So wonderful. Thank you also. I learned so much. So listening to you and listening to the reaction and to questions, I think it's for all of us a wonderful meeting to discover new ways of understanding this mysterious. So if Dušan, should we now say?
Yeah, I think that we came to the end of very interesting evening. I was really fascinated by the width of topics, just talking about voice, how many implications does it have? And I enjoyed having discussion. So Violeta, I think you agree that we came to the end, and I will say goodbye to everybody and see you soon in a couple of weeks.
In
Okay.
2 weeks, exactly.
Bye-bye. In 2 weeks, yeah.
Please
That's a
come
couple.
again. And thank you very much for the question, also very important for our speakers. Thank you. Bye-bye, Wolfgang.
Okay.
Bye-bye.